The dust clouds, kicked up by cattle hooves, had barely settled over Copper Creek when word spread through the town like wildfire that Jeremiah Blackwood was hiring again. The wealthy rancher's reputation preceded him wherever he went, casting a shadow longer than the mountains that surrounded his sprawling estate. For 15 years, he had ruled over the largest ranch in 3 counties with an iron fist and a heart seemingly carved from the same unforgiving stone that dotted his property. Men twice his size would cross the street when they saw him coming. Shopkeepers would stutter over their words when conducting business, and even the preacher would choose his Sunday sermons carefully when he knew Blackwood was in attendance. Jeremiah Blackwood hadn't always been the terror of Copper Creek. Once upon a time, he had been a different man entirely, full of dreams and hope, with a smile that could light up a room and a laugh that rang across the valley like church bells on Sunday morning. But that was before the war, before he lost his brother in the muddy trenches of some forgotten battlefield, before his young wife died in childbirth, along with the son who would have carried on the Blackwood name. The man who returned from those dark years was hollow-eyed and sharp-tongued, building walls around his heart higher than the fence posts that marked his property lines. The Blackwood Ranch sprawled across thousands of acres of prime grazing land, dotted with the finest cattle money could buy, and worked by hands who knew better than to speak unless spoken to. The ranch house itself was a monument to wealth and isolation, a 3-story Victorian mansion that seemed oddly out of place among the rugged landscape of the American frontier. Its windows stared out like empty eyes over the vast expanse of prairie, and inside, the rooms echoed with the loneliness of a man who had forgotten how to live among people. Servants came and went from the Blackwood household with alarming regularity. Some lasted a week, others merely a day, before packing their belongings and heading back to town with stories that grew more terrifying with each telling. There was the cook, who claimed Blackwood had thrown the entire pot of stew across the kitchen because the salt was a fraction too heavy. The groundskeeper who swore the rancher had threatened to horsewhip him for allowing a single weed to grow near the front porch. The previous housekeeper who packed her bags in the middle of the night after Blackwood supposedly screamed at her for humming while she worked, claiming the sound reminded him of his dead wife. These stories, whether entirely true or embellished by fear and imagination, created an atmosphere of dread around the Blackwood name that permeated every corner of Copper Creek. Parents used his name to frighten misbehaving children into compliance. Saloon patrons would lower their voices to whispers when discussing ranch business. Even the town's mayor, a man who prided himself on standing up to anyone, would find urgent business elsewhere when Blackwood rode into town on his black stallion, his coattails flowing behind him like the wings of some dark angel of vengeance. It was into this atmosphere of fear and whispered warnings that Eleanor May Sullivan arrived on the Tuesday morning train from Kansas City. She stepped onto the wooden platform with nothing more than a worn leather satchel and a letter of introduction from the domestic service agency that had sent her west in response to Blackwood's increasingly desperate requests for household help. Eleanor was not a particularly striking woman by conventional standards, standing average height with brown hair pulled back in a practical bun and wearing a simple grey dress that spoke of modest means and practical sensibilities. But there was something in her green eyes that suggested depths of character that couldn't be measured by appearance alone. The townspeople who witnessed her arrival couldn't help but stare. Here was yet another lamb being led to slaughter at the Blackwood Ranch, they thought. Some of the more charitable souls considered warning her about what she was walking into, but the woman carried herself with such quiet confidence that their words died in their throats. There was no fear in her stride as she asked directions to the ranch, no hesitation in her voice when she inquired about transportation to her new position. If anything, she seemed almost eager to begin her work, a reaction so unusual that it left the locals shaking their heads in bewilderment. The ranch foreman, a grizzled cowboy named Pete Morrison, who had worked for Blackwood longer than anyone else, met Eleanor at the gates with a mixture of curiosity and resignation. Pete had seen too many domestic workers come and go to hold out much hope for this latest addition, but something about the woman's demeanor gave him pause. She didn't flinch when he warned her about Blackwood's temperament, didn't ask nervous questions about what she was getting herself into. Instead, she simply thanked him for the information and asked to be shown to her quarters so she could begin her duties. Eleanor's first encounter with Jeremiah Blackwood came that very evening as she was preparing dinner in the mansion's spacious but underutilized kitchen. She had spent the afternoon familiarizing herself with the house, noting the dust that had accumulated on furniture that hadn't been properly cleaned in months, the windows that hadn't seen a thorough washing in even longer, and the general air of neglect that hung over the entire residence like a shroud. Rather than being intimidated by the scope of work ahead of her, Eleanor seemed energized by the challenge, rolling up her sleeves and setting about her tasks with the methodical efficiency of someone who took pride in their craft. When Blackwood burst through the kitchen door that evening, his face already twisted into the scowl that had sent so many previous employees fleeing into the night, Eleanor didn't even look up from the stove, where she was stirring a pot of what smelled like the first home-cooked meal the house had seen in months. The rancher stood in the doorway for several long moments, clearly expecting some reaction to his presence, but Eleanor continued her work as if she were completely alone in the room. Finally, unable to contain himself any longer, Blackwood cleared his throat loudly and demanded to know what she thought she was doing. Eleanor turned slowly from the stove, wiping her hands on her apron with deliberate care before meeting Blackwood's fierce gaze with steady eyes that showed not the slightest hint of fear or intimidation. In a calm, measured voice that seemed to echo strangely in the tension-filled kitchen, she informed him that she was preparing his dinner and asked if he had any particular preferences for how his beef should be cooked. The simple, practical nature of her response seemed to catch Blackwood completely off guard, and for perhaps the first time in years, he found himself at a loss for words. The rancher had prepared himself for cowering, for stammering apologies, for the familiar dance of fear that had characterized all his interactions with domestic staff for as long as he could remember. Instead, he was faced with a woman who seemed to regard him as nothing more threatening than any other employer, who spoke to him with the same respectful but unintimidated tone she might use with anyone else. It was so unexpected, so completely contrary to what he had grown accustomed to, that he actually took a step backward, his prepared tirade dying on his lips before it could be born. Eleanor's routine in the Blackwood household quickly established itself as something entirely new and unprecedented. She rose before dawn to begin her daily tasks, moving through the mansion with quiet efficiency as she gradually began to restore order to rooms that had been allowed to fall into disrepair. She cleaned without complaint, cooked meals that actually tasted like food rather than barely edible necessity, and maintained the kind of household schedule that the mansion hadn't seen since before Blackwood's wife had died. Most remarkably of all, she seemed completely immune to her employer's legendary temper. When Blackwood would storm into a room shouting about some perceived slight or imperfection, Eleanor would listen patiently to his complaints, acknowledge any legitimate concerns, and then simply continue with her work. She never argued with him, never cowered before his rage, but neither did she allow his outbursts to alter her behavior or her routine. It was as if she had recognized something in his anger that others had missed, seeing through the fierce exterior to something more vulnerable underneath. Her calm responses had the peculiar effect of deflating his fury before it could build to its usual crescendo, leaving him feeling oddly unsettled and confused. The change in Blackwood's behavior didn't happen overnight, but it was noticeable enough that the ranch hands began to comment on it among themselves. The man who had been known to fly into a rage over the smallest infractions seemed to be finding fewer things to complain about. His voice, when he spoke to Eleanor, lacked the harsh edge that characterized his interactions with everyone else. He began to linger in whatever room she was working in, ostensibly checking on her progress, but more often simply standing in silence, watching her work with an expression that none of his employees had ever seen before. Eleanor, for her part, seemed to take these observations in stride. She would answer his questions when he asked them, offer brief reports on her progress when appropriate, and occasionally make gentle suggestions about household matters that needed attention. She never pushed, never presumed to overstep the boundaries of her position, but there was something in her manner that suggested she saw past the fearsome reputation to the lonely man underneath. When she spoke to him, it was with the same respectful directness she showed everyone, but there were moments when her voice carried a warmth that hadn't been heard in the Blackwood mansion for many years. The transformation became more apparent as weeks turned into months. Blackwood's legendary temper, while not completely tamed, seemed to have lost much of its destructive force. The ranch hands noticed that he no longer flew into rages over minor mistakes, and some of the older employees began to remember glimpses of the man he had been before grief and anger had consumed him. Pete Morrison, who had weathered more of Blackwood's storms than anyone, found himself actually looking forward to his regular meetings with the boss, something that would have been unthinkable just a few months earlier. The change was most evident in the mansion itself, which under Eleanor's care began to come alive again in ways that seemed to transcend mere cleaning and maintenance. Windows sparkled in the morning sun. Rooms that had been closed off for years were gradually reopened and restored to their former beauty, and the sound of activity replaced the oppressive silence that had characterized the house for so long. Eleanor had somehow managed to create an atmosphere of warmth and life in a place that had been a monument to isolation and grief. Perhaps most remarkably, Blackwood began to take meals in the dining room again, something he hadn't done since his wife's death. Eleanor would serve his dinner each evening on the fine china that had been gathering dust in the cabinets, setting the long table with care and attention to detail that transformed the simple act of eating into something approaching a civilized ritual. At first, Blackwood ate in silence, but gradually he began to make small comments about the food, the weather, or the day's activities on the ranch. Eleanor would respond appropriately, never pushing for more conversation than he was willing to give, but always ready with a thoughtful reply when he chose to speak. The townspeople of Copper Creek began to notice changes as well. When Blackwood rode into town on his weekly supply runs, he no longer carried himself with the same aura of barely controlled hostility that had characterized his public appearances for years. He was still not what anyone would call friendly, but the sharp edges seemed to have been worn smooth somehow. Shopkeepers found themselves able to conduct business with him without the nervous tension that had previously marked such encounters. He even nodded politely to other customers, a small gesture that might have gone unnoticed with anyone else, but represented a significant shift in the behavior of Jeremiah Blackwood. The change became the subject of intense speculation throughout the town. Some attributed it to Eleanor's influence, though none could quite explain how a simple maid had managed to accomplish what no one else had been able to do in 15 years. Others suggested that Blackwood was simply getting older and mellowing with age, though those who knew him best dismissed this theory as wishful thinking. A few of the more romantically inclined citizens wondered if there might be something developing between the wealthy rancher and his new employee, but Eleanor's professional demeanor and Blackwood's continued reserve seemed to argue against such speculation. The truth was perhaps simpler and more complex than any of the theories being bandied about in the saloons and general stores of Copper Creek. Eleanor had done something that no one else had managed to do in all the years since Blackwood's return from war and widowhood. She had treated him like a human being rather than a force of nature to be feared or appeased. She had seen past the armor of anger and intimidation to the wounded soul beneath, and in doing so had offered him something he had forgotten he needed: simple, uncomplicated, human dignity. It wasn't that Eleanor was unaware of Blackwood's reputation or unmoved by his displays of temper. She had simply chosen to respond to them differently than everyone else had. Where others saw a tyrant to be feared, she saw a man in pain. Where others heard threats and fury, she heard the voice of someone who had forgotten how to ask for what he needed without demanding it. Her calm responses and steady presence had gradually created a space where Blackwood could begin to remember who he had been before grief had twisted him into someone even he no longer recognized. The relationship between employer and employee began to evolve in subtle ways that neither of them initially acknowledged. Blackwood found himself asking Eleanor's opinion on household matters that went beyond her strict duties, seeking her input on everything from menu planning to the arrangement of furniture in rooms that were being restored to active use. Eleanor, while maintaining appropriate professional boundaries, began to offer gentle suggestions about other aspects of the ranch operation, drawing on a practical wisdom that impressed Blackwood more than he cared to admit. Their evening conversations over dinner gradually expanded beyond mere pleasantries to include discussions of books, current events, and memories of their respective pasts. Eleanor spoke carefully about her life before coming to the ranch, revealing herself to be a woman of education and refinement who had chosen domestic service not from lack of other options, but from a genuine calling to create order and comfort in the world around her. Blackwood, in turn, began to share fragments of his own history, speaking tentatively at first about his life before the war, his dreams for the ranch, and even eventually about his lost family. The breakthrough moment came on a cold winter evening when Blackwood found Eleanor in the mansion's library, carefully dusting the shelves of books that hadn't been touched in years. She was humming softly as she worked, the same sort of gentle tune that had once sent previous employees fleeing in terror. But instead of erupting in fury, Blackwood found himself standing in the doorway, listening to the sound with an expression of wonder and pain that spoke of memories long buried. When Eleanor noticed his presence and began to apologize for the noise, he surprised them both by asking her not to stop. In that moment, something fundamental shifted between them. For the first time since his wife's death, Blackwood allowed himself to remember the good times rather than focusing solely on what he had lost. The sound of Eleanor's humming had broken through the walls he had built around his heart, reminding him that joy and music and simple human warmth were still possible, even after great loss. Eleanor, recognizing the significance of the moment, continued her work and her gentle song, creating a space where healing could begin to happen. From that evening forward, the change in Blackwood became impossible to ignore. He began to take a more active interest in the daily operations of the ranch, working alongside his men instead of simply barking orders from a distance. He instituted regular meetings with his foreman to discuss improvements and innovations, showing a collaborative spirit that none of them had ever experienced from him before. He even began to speak of expanding the operation, of building something that could serve as a legacy rather than simply a fortress of isolation. The transformation extended to his relationships with the townspeople as well. Blackwood began to attend church services again, sitting quietly in the back pew, but participating in the communal act of worship that he had avoided for years. He made donations to local charities without fanfare, contributed to community improvement projects, and even began to socialize, albeit carefully, with other prominent citizens of Copper Creek. The man who had once been the town's most feared resident was slowly becoming one of its most respected members. Eleanor watched these changes with quiet satisfaction, knowing that she had played a role in Blackwood's transformation, but wise enough to understand that the real work had been his own. She had simply provided the safe space and steady presence necessary for him to begin the long process of healing from wounds that had festered for far too long. Her approach had been neither dramatic nor confrontational, but rather the patient application of kindness, respect, and unwavering professional competence that had gradually worn away the barriers Blackwood had erected around himself. As seasons passed and the ranch continued to prosper under Blackwood's renewed leadership, the story of the wealthy rancher's transformation became part of the local folklore. People marveled at how one woman had accomplished what an entire town had failed to do, how simple human decency and professional competence had succeeded where fear and intimidation had only made things worse. Eleanor became something of a local hero in her own right, though she continued to go about her duties with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized her work from the beginning. The final proof of Blackwood's transformation came when he announced his intention to host a harvest celebration at the ranch, inviting not just his employees, but the entire community of Copper Creek to join him in celebrating the year's successes. It was the first social event the mansion had seen since before his wife's death, and Eleanor worked tirelessly to ensure that every detail was perfect. The evening was a resounding success, with Blackwood playing the role of gracious host to perfection, and Eleanor moving seamlessly between her duties and her unofficial role as the evening's organizing force. As the celebration wound down and the last guests departed, Blackwood found Eleanor in the kitchen, quietly cleaning up the remnants of the evening's festivities. He stood watching her for a long moment, thinking about how much his life had changed since her arrival, about the man he had been and the man he was becoming. When she noticed his presence and began to apologize for not finishing more quickly, he stopped her with a gentle gesture and spoke words that he hadn't said to anyone in 15 years. He thanked her, not just for the evening's work, but for everything she had done, for seeing something in him that he had thought was lost forever. Eleanor accepted his gratitude with the same quiet dignity that had characterized all their interactions, but there was a warmth in her eyes that spoke of mutual respect and genuine affection. In that moment, both of them understood that what had begun as a simple employment relationship had grown into something much deeper and more meaningful. The story of Jeremiah Blackwood and Eleanor Sullivan became a testament to the power of human kindness and the possibility of redemption, even in the most unlikely circumstances. Eleanor had done what no one else had been able to do, not through any dramatic confrontation or grand gesture, but through the simple act of treating a wounded soul with dignity and respect. She had shown that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in fighting monsters, but in refusing to see people as monsters in the first place. Years later, when people in Copper Creek told the story of the wealthy rancher who had terrorized the town until the right woman came along, they always emphasized that Eleanor had never set out to change Jeremiah Blackwood. She had simply done her job with competence and kindness, creating the space where change became possible. Her legacy was not just in the transformation of one difficult man, but in the demonstration that human dignity and professional excellence could triumph over fear and isolation, that the right response to anger was not more anger, but patient, persistent compassion. The tale serves as a reminder that behind every difficult person lies a story of pain and loss, and that sometimes the most profound changes come not from grand gestures, but from the accumulated weight of small kindnesses. Eleanor Sullivan had shown an entire community what was possible when someone chose to respond to hostility with grace, to meet anger with calm professionalism, and to see the human being behind the frightening reputation. Did you enjoy this tale from the Old West? If you found yourself drawn into the story of Jeremiah Blackwood and Eleanor Sullivan, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories from America's frontier days. And here's something I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever encountered someone who seemed difficult or intimidating at first, but turned out to be different once you got to know them? Share your story below, because sometimes the most interesting tales come from real-life experiences that mirror the lessons we find in these historical narratives.